Hi there. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Lynn Dome, and I'm Women in Cybersecurity Executive Director. We often go by our acronym WiCyS, and it's spelled WiCYS. We pronounce it WiCyS like we sisters because that's exactly what we are. We are a global cyber sisterhood. So, our mission is to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity. We have over 7,500 members represented in over 70 countries. We also have 58 professional affiliates, and professional affiliates are mini WiCyS organizations. They're all throughout Africa, Australia, Canada, France, India, Pakistan, Norway, the UK, Israel, and throughout the United States. We have corporate affiliates like WiCyS Lockheed Martin and WiCyS MITRE. And then we have specialty affiliates in artificial intelligence, BISO, critical infrastructure, cloud security, data privacy and cybersecurity law, LGBTQ plus pride, military, neurodiversity, colors of inclusion, Latinas in cybersecurity. We just launched our WiCyS Deaf affiliate, and we have so many others. And then on top of all of that, we have 214 student chapters with Microsoft Philanthropies funding a global student chapter initiative. So what we do is we create opportunities, we align it with resources, align it with our strategic partners, and cultivate a culture of inclusion, a place where all belong within the cybersecurity workforce. So we have many different initiatives that support our efforts, including skill development training programs funded by Google, Meta, Bloomberg, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, AWS, Target, Fortinet, Science Institute, ISC Squared, and so many others. We have scholarships, grants, and awards not only to our conference, but to many other conferences. Our speaking and media engagements are there so our members can be what others can see. And that's the cybersecurity professionals that they are. We have a Job Plus Plus where all our members can get recruited from and update their profiles, upload their resumes, and all our 65 strategic partners can recruit from that job board. We have veteran apprenticeship programs, internship programs, leadership summits, series, market research, an incredible mentor mentee program where we have 1,600 just recently enrolled into our cohort that's going on right now. Our speakers bureau, all this and so much more. So we owe it as a special thanks to our strategic partners, and we have our tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 strategic partners here. And for today's event, we're really proud that it's brought to us by Wayfair, and soon we'll be able to get to that topic at hand. But before I pass the mic on over to Rachel, I just want to let everyone know that this is your moment to ask questions. We're going to have Rachel here talking about how to create an enterprise RBAC program. And this is your moment to listen in, tune in, ask for additional resources, connect with Rachel on LinkedIn, and get your questions answered live during today's event. So if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the WiCyS newsletter to stay up to date on all our upcoming training programs and events. We have lots going out throughout the summer and into the fall already booked and mapped out. Even going into the new year already. So please subscribe to our newsletter to never miss a beat. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic on over to Rachel as she could take it from here. Rachel?
Okay, thank you, Lynn. My name is Rachel Anderson. I've been in identity access management for over 15 years, close to 18 years now. Today, I'm going to talk about some things that I've learned about role-based access controls over the course of my career. I'll go into a few identity management concepts because I'm not making assumptions that your specialty is identity and access management. And I will try to show you a few tips and tricks that I've learned or picked up during the course of my career. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. Second. So about me, I got into identity and access management in a different way than I'm sure most of you. My ex-husband was a SiteMinder engineer back in early 2000, and he was sent all over the Eastern Seaboard to do single sign-on implementations for some of the major companies on the East Coast. His first language wasn't English, so I helped him write his papers and everything. And there I picked up some concepts of identity and access management. And from there, I managed to land a role with a software company on the East Coast doing an assessment of a buy-build assessment of either replacing or building their identity and access management system. And for there, I just kept going. I've spent a lot of time in this area as a business analyst, especially in identity and access management. I've done access modeling, role engineering, which is building and creating RBAC roles. I've worked with single sign-on integrations as a non-technical person, and I've also done identity integrations for various companies. My teammate David and I, who I hope David is on this call, we always joke about how identity and access management is such a fascinating topic, like, and how great it is. And I hope that you'll feel some of that, my enthusiasm for this subject. I have a degree in religion and biblical literature with a minor in Judaic studies from Smith College, which is a women's college in Massachusetts. And for non-work, I enjoy art, painting, decorating, etc. So let's see here. Oh yeah, I also live in a Victorian house in Eastern Connecticut that I've been fixing up. So let me go on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys just a refresher on RBAC. Like I said, I don't know what level of knowledge you all are coming into this with. So RBAC stands for role-based access controls, and it's a technique or a method of granting users the access they need to perform their job. It can also be used as a way to, not just at the job level, but also, like, let's say, for example, I'm an employee or I'm a person at this location. So it's not only for the specific job they're performing. You might have heard the terms ABAC, which is attribute-based access, RBAC, which is role-based access, and PBAC, which is policy-based access. There's not a hard line between each of them. So when I use RBAC here, I'm also talking about roles that are granted by the person's attributes. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So for the purpose of this webinar, I will be referring to RBAC as either a role that is requested or a role that is granted automatically based on a person's employee data. So the expectation for role-based access controls in most companies is when they hire a new person, they expect that person to have the access they need to do their job from day one. Now, I mentioned before that I was a contractor consultant doing identity and access management projects for several companies over the course of 18 years. And I have never once gone into a company and got all the access that I needed from day one. And the reason for that is because it can be difficult to know what someone needs to do their job if that hasn't been thought out ahead of time. And it's really the companies that are the most mature, I guess I would say, who have started thinking about that and who are making strides to do that automation. But it's easier said than done. So I'm going to go into the next slide here. These are the topics that I want to talk about. It seems like a lot at the moment, but it'll go pretty quickly. So, common myths about role-based access controls. We have the Spider-Man meme. First is magical thinking. Second is limited thinking. And third is avoidance thinking. So magical thinking, which I also like to call magic pill thinking, is that role-based access controls will solve all of our authorization problems. Not a lot of companies, if they've been around for any amount of time, already have a lot of debt when it comes to their access management. They might have multiple unused Active Directory groups or permission groups. They might have like a whole bunch of dependencies and everything. So RBAC is not going to eliminate all that hygiene, that technical debt, but it will help with automating things and making things easier. The second assumption is that roles just fall out of thin air, like they just happen. That's not true. There's a lot of thought that goes behind this. It's not that, Sandy is going to be starting and HR just automatically knows what Sandy should get. There's a lot of thought. There's a lot of analysis that goes into determining what Sandy or someone like her should be getting for her job. I'm going to skip over the third bullet, but limited thinking is some people believe that you can only be part of one role. That's not the case. In fact, that's not good practice, because if you have one role, like Rachel has one role, that means that my access needs are not going to be exactly the same as everyone else at Wayfair. And that means that we're going to need 20,000 roles for every permutation of access needs that everyone at Wayfair needs. It's just not sustainable. It's not good from a maintenance perspective. It's not good from to maintain on an operational perspective. And it makes governance just not possible. Another thing that I've come across pretty often is when you try to create access, you say, look at the access that Tara has and copy all of Tara's access and give it to Rachel. One of the things to consider, though, is that Tara might have been in another department before she moved into my department. And so she might have access that was retained from, let's say, the marketing department. That's not appropriate for her. It should have been revoked, but it wasn't. And it's definitely not appropriate for me. It's just not a good idea to do that, just on an ad hoc basis, giving someone else's access. And one of my favorite things to quote, which was told to me by a director at a former company, is, RBAC can't be done. We've tried it twice. That is not true. It's difficult. It takes a certain mentality, thought process to do it. And I'll try to teach you some of those things. And in a lot of ways, I mentioned that I like art. It's a very creative process. So if you're just expecting that role-based access controls is about putting things in boxes, you wouldn't be exactly wrong, but it is very much a creative process. And it involves very flexible analytical thinking as well. The third bullet point, not to stay too long on this slide, is avoidance thinking. So role-based access controls is not a technology problem. It's a business problem that the technology department, identity and access management, security, whatever it's like in your organization, is providing a service to the business to help the business have access that aligns to their processes and how they organize. And the last avoidance thinking is that talent should somehow magically know what a person should have access to. Talent deals with compensation data, requisition data, job data. They don't know exactly the access that's needed for a person to do their job. That's the security team, the technology team, whatever IAM falls under in your organization. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay. So some benefits of role-based access controls, we talked about the myths. Some benefits are it gives the business customers control. Like I mentioned before, role-based access is a service that technology provides to the business, but the business owns the definition of what those roles are, because the roles are intended to align and to be tailored to the processes that the business performs and how the business organizes and thinks about themselves. Role-based access controls also allows consistent alignment of user populations to resources and the access needed to perform a job function. And it, as I mentioned before, it increases the velocity of providing access through automation, so that when someone is hired, they can at least get a good portion of the access they need to do their job. For the organization as a whole, it provides cost savings related to reduced overhead and better license control. So what that means is that we don't have to submit multiple requests for tickets for Rachel or Sandy to have these 20 pieces of access and have them all be manually fulfilled. And we can also have more control over granting and revoking licenses for software. It is scalable as the organizational grows, and it reduces the time and friction to reorganize. So reorganize is if you have a department, let's say within finance, that moves to another section of finance, if that department's access was granted like with an AD as to a work group, things can break when that move happens. And role-based access controls goes at a level higher, and it makes decisions at the employee data level and not at the Active Directory or technology level. One of the benefits also for role-based access controls is that it provides the ability, it supports the audit and governance certification capabilities. So if you have SOX applications that require certification or governance, you can bundle the SOX access into specific roles that you want to be able to govern later on. And by the way, I locked my cat out of the room, but she's meowing from behind the door. So if you hear that, it's not a baby, it's a cat. She's old and she's deaf. So it also aligns with HR established roles and responsibilities. So when you have compensation job architecture, the access will align with those definitions that are put forth within Workday or PeopleSoft or whatever the HR system is. Okay. So first, the basics. Let me talk about a few concepts of identity and access management. I'm going to go to the next slide. So what is identity? Identity is who you are. In a business or corporate context, it can be, in Jane Smith's example here, that you are salaried, you are an employee, you are a manager, you are your job title, in this case with Jane Smith, senior counsel. You work at the Boston headquarters of your company, and it can even be like your employee ID, like your unique identifier within the company. From a personal perspective, your identity can be that you are a mother, you are a sister, you are a daughter, you are a wife. All of those things describe who you are. So again, in the context of a business, your identity is the way that you are identified and the attributes that are used to identify you in the context of how you relate to your organization or your company. What does your company care about? How do they want to identify you? And typically the buckets are, they're a corporate employee, they're a field employee, they're a contractor, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all identifiers, which we call attributes. We call them identity attributes. And typically those attributes would come from a canonical source, which would be Workday, PeopleSoft, any of the HR systems. That's where they originate. So they originate with your HR system. Identity is not user account. So you think of it this way. I have a bank account. I have an email account. Those things are not me, right? In the same way, Jane or I, Rachel, have an identity, a digital identity within my company, but I also have accounts associated with that. Like I might have an account in Active Directory. I'll have an account in Slack, which we use to communicate with at Wayfair, and I'll have an account in Google and other places. That's not me. That's not my identity. Those are my accounts. So there's a difference there. I wanted to have that be clear. All right, so the next slide we'll talk about user population. So this is where you take identity data and you try to find people who have commonalities between them. So in this case, Jane is in the same identity population as other people at the Boston headquarters, which is I'm a headquarters employee. She's in the same population as other managers, so she's part of the manager user population, and she's also part of the legal department, so she can be part of the population of the legal department. Population does not equal role, but it's a starting point for a role. So just remember that. It's a way that we can segment users into common groupings and categorizations while we do role engineering. And it's one of the first steps we do, is to try to figure out how to group people and what data can be used from the HR system to group those people with accuracy and unambiguously. So user populations, there's two definitions for that. One is the business definition, and this is the definition that is the most important, because this definition, the business definition, reflects how the business thinks of themselves. And when I say business, I mean like a department within the company. Let's say finance. Finance thinks of themselves according to how they organize and what functions exist within the finance department. Broadly speaking, I'm sure that finance departments in most companies are very similar. There's people who can do accounts payable, accounts receivable. There are people who are accountants, controllers, whatever the case may be. Each of those populations within finance in this example can perform specific functions and cannot perform other functions. So this is what I mean by the business definition of a user population. User population is not just the finance org, although it could be. But if you want to go into the job-related access, you have to break that down and understand how the business identifies itself and how it identifies the populations within it. The technical definition is how we use technology and configurations to try to detect people who fit into the business definition. So let's say we use Workday as an HR system. And let's say that Workday has data that can tell us unequivocally that people within the accounts payable function in finance can be identified. We know how to identify them. That is the technical definition, is to find that data within the HR system that you can use to identify the populations that the business has identified exist within it. If you are not able to unequivocally and unambiguously identify who does accounts payable, then you just can't create a role for that population of users. Because in this example, if the accounts payable and the accounts receivable person have the same like HR data, which is probably unlikely, but let's just assume it is, then you don't want to give them a role that can do both, because then you can have conflict, a task conflict, and that could be a problem in this case. So here's some identity population instances where Jane's identity, John's identity, and Kathy's identity. Jane and John both belong to the Boston, Massachusetts population. John and Kathy belong to finance, and all three of them are managers. Just a high level understanding of how user populations work. Next, we're going to talk about roles. So I like this. I wrote this about 2 years ago, and it has been very helpful to getting people to understand about roles. So I'm going to let you read through this, but basically roles are like hats. There are some professions where you need a hat to do your job, whether it's a firefighter's hat, a construction's hat, whatever the case may be. You might be a volunteer firefighter on weekends and work in a construction zone during the week where you need two hats. That doesn't mean that those two hats should be sold together. They should always be separate because they're for different functions. I'm going to let you read through the bulleted list of how roles are like hats, just to give you an idea. Okay. All right, I'm going to talk some more because I don't know how I'm doing with time, but Like I said before, user population does not equal role-based access role. Doesn't equal role. I can be in the manager population, and that could be a broad enterprise role. All managers at my company get the same access. But it doesn't always necessarily translate into role. And I'll tell you why. Because sometimes you'll have a role that can be given to two or more populations. And sometimes you'll have a population that can be given two or more roles. It just depends. But it's a good starting point to kind of start to define what roles you want to create. And here's another one I just threw on last night, which is role definition. So I talk about role definition. That is the access that is provided by that role. I'm going to move on a little bit. So now we're going to get into, okay, how does it work? How do we do it? How do we think about creating a role-based access control program? Hope it's not a problem. And what I've heard a lot when I talk to people within identity and access management and security is they have a conception that in order to create roles, the first and only step you need to do is to run reports of all the access that someone has, and then create a role. Let's say run the access that the accounts payable team has in finance, and then create a role that has all that access. That's not a good idea. And the reason that's not a good idea is going back to the business definition of what the business's populations are. If you were just to run all the access, let's say there's 100 groups that people in accounts payable have, and then say, okay, these 100 groups belong to this role, without first understanding what the business need is, how they work, what their tasks are, what applications they use to perform those tasks, you'll probably end up giving them too much access for the reason of someone could have come from another department and not had their access revoked. Some of that access might have been deprecated and not used anymore, so it's just junk. And others could have just had nothing to do with the person's job, basically. Another reason you don't want to do that is because you don't want to create a single role for a team. In fact, you most likely don't want to create a role for a team. You want to create a role for a function, a business function. There's my cat again. So when I say team and business function, you can have a team, 5 teams within your organization that perform very similar business functions and have very similar access needs, but they could be in different organizations. For example, if you have a technology team that supports another team in operations, that technology team might have access to operations databases. That doesn't mean that, so that technology team might have some of the same access and need to perform the same functions that the operations team might need. If that were the case, and if I were looking at a situation like that, I wouldn't say, okay, I'm going to create a role for this technology team and give them the operations access, and I'm going to create another role for the operations team and give them the same access. I would create a role that provides that access, especially if it's high risk or elevated access, and maybe even 2 roles, depending on compliance or governance requirements, and grant it to that team or those 2 teams together and say, this provides this discrete small amount of access that is, by the way, it's data and it's considered subject to, let's say, SOX or some sort of high risk. We need to have like a compliance. So I would do something like that. I've talked too much about this slide. I'm gonna move on to the next slide. Okay. So what goes into creating an enterprise RBAC program? First is, and by the way, hi Billy, my former manager. We went through this together a few years ago, is to create a vision. of what are your objectives? What do you want to see? What do you want the fruit of this effort to be? What is your vision? Second is the principles. What guides us? Third is the standards. Now, this is where you'll have to do some work because standards are going to help you move forward and not get you backed up into a corner. And that is, standards are how we ensure reliability and consistency in what we build. So, for example, if I'm creating a role for finance or 5 different roles for finance, I'm always going to label them as finance in the same way so that I can easily find all the roles that belong to finance. In that same vein, I'm going to try to stay away from the term all or everyone because everyone is never everyone. For example, if someone says, give this role to everyone in technology, sometimes they don't mean contractors, they mean employees. So you have to be very specific with how you name things and come up with a syntax for how you want those reference IDs within the name to go. By reference IDs, like, I'll get into that later. Actually, there's some bonus slides at the end of this slide deck that I have asked WiCyS to share to help you out a little more. The other concept of standards is role types. So role types are really, they're not the role themselves, but they are concepts that allows you to think about how you want to scope the role. Do you want the role to be broad and grant shallow access to, let's say, all employees in the company? If that's the case, then that role type is a birthright role. It's low risk access that's for a broad population of users. And you would name it accordingly. You would name it based on however you want to identify that population. On the other side, there's the concept of what I call system roles, which is not really the role that lives in a system, but it's a role that grants access to a specific system and it's limited. So an example of this would be if you have a system that provides physical access security. It controls, you can configure your doors and your badges. You want to grant that to a narrow, very intentional population of users. And the access, because it's a security system, is considered to be a high risk, very like a privileged access. I would use a system role for that as a concept. So in that case, if I had a role that granted access to our physical security system, I would not add any other access to that role, even if the population of people who have access to the security system also need access to a database. You don't want to mix the two because you want to keep that very distinct and separate, because that would, you'd want to be able to govern that access and to know exactly who has it. And you don't want to mix it with any other kind of access. And somewhere in the middle is medium risk access. Let's say I work at a call center organization or I work at a store, and there might be, like, if I worked at a store, I could be a cashier, job related access. Rachel, I work in identity and access management. I don't need cashier access. If I had it, would it be a disaster? Probably not. Mostly because I don't go to a store, right? That kind of access is related to your job function and it's appropriate for your job, but it's not going to be subject to SOX regulations or a privileged high risk access. So you wouldn't want to define it as narrowly and have as much controls around it. I'm not going to talk right in this slide about the work streams because we're going to go over that in the next few slides. So I'm going to go to the next slide right now. Okay. I've already talked a lot about that, but this is a slide about role types. And this is, again, how we think about how the role is to be scoped, i.e., is it a broad scope of users, a narrow scope of users, a broad scope of access, a narrow scope of access? And it also speaks to what we want to orient the role to. Is the role oriented to a single system? Is it oriented to a type of data, like all operational data? Is it oriented to enterprise population, like all employees? What is it oriented to? So it's the orientation of the role, the intention of the role, and the scope of the role. And I talk about that in the first bullet. You can read those examples here. Like I said before, you don't want to commingle high risk access in the same role as low risk access. And the reason that is because when you perform certifications on that role and there's revocations, they could very well revoke the low risk access that could be essential to someone doing their job. You want to keep those things separate. I'm going to go to the next slide. The PDF that I asked WiCyS to distribute contains this slide, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. This is a chart that shows kind of a scale of the high risk access, medium risk access, and low risk access, and how that relates to risk, governance, controls, population. So you see here that the low risk access is granted to a broader population. It's for access that is not related to compliance, general purpose resources, internal data, non-restricted data. High risk is for access those are the system roles that I talked about, which is for access related to compliance, PCI, or for restricted, highly sensitive resources, like I said, the physical security application, PII data, privileged access, admin access, those types of things, where you need to look at them more often and review their access more often. And in the middle is the medium risk access. This slide deck is also in the PDF, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So this talks about what is the work stream for creating roles. Like when you first engaged, let's say that you decide that you want to, in my case, I want to roll out role-based access to Wayfair's all of our warehouse locations, right? We have different types of warehouses. We have warehouses that are only focused on home delivery. They're smaller. They only do delivery. We have other warehouses that are fulfillment centers that have completely different functions than home delivery locations, and then other middle mile, et cetera. These are all standard types of warehouse locations. So the first thing that I would do is I would meet with someone who knows warehouses and their functions, maybe even the warehouse IT people. And I would try to define who's in scope, not who as in Rachel, Jeff, John, but who as in what populations are in scope for the roles that the roles that I'm intending to build. And we would agree. We would talk it through. We would discuss how their business runs. What are the key functions within warehouses? What sets HDOs or home delivery operations warehouses apart from fulfillment centers? How are their tasks different? And from there, I would try to scope out the populations and the functions within those warehouses. And we come to an agreement of, okay, these people are in scope, these functions are in scope, but the people who fix the machines in the warehouses or the people who maintain the warehouses, they're not in scope. And we would come to that agreement. Then importantly, I would look to my HR system, in this case, Workday, and I would look to see if Workday has data that can very clearly support identifying those populations that we agreed to. If Workday doesn't have data that's able to support each of those different population scopes, then I would go up another level until I could find something that the Workday data could support. There we go. Okay. The next thing you want to do is to segment the user population. This is what I was kind of talking about earlier. If I was talking about warehouses, I'd say, okay, this segment of warehouse users say all warehouse users get these 5 things in common, whether they're fulfillment centers or home delivery operations or whatever type of warehouse they are. They all need this. They all need an account for like a scanning device to scan boxes with. That's what they have in common. And then you want to segment them. Okay, HDO people or home delivery people perform these functions, and in order for them to fulfill those functions, they need access to these applications, this data, etc. But this other type of warehouse and those other types don't need it. That's where you'd start segmenting the populations and start drilling into the access that they need to do their job. Now, you can, and you probably should, run a list of all the access that each of those populations gets, so you have them side by side, but that's not going to end up being the final list of access that they're going to get. You still have to vet that access against the functions they perform, because if you don't, you'll give them too much or stuff that's not needed. And you don't want to create a role that has too much access, because it's very difficult to maintain that. You want to keep it as light as possible. And if you have to create a second role, do it. Okay. I'm ahead of myself. So this is where you inventory the access. So you look at the populations that you've identified and you've agreed to with your business customer. You inventory the access they have, and then you analyze what access they need. So this is what I was saying earlier. If I work at a home delivery organization, a warehouse that just delivers boxes to people's houses, and I need access to my scanning gun to scan boxes, I need access to, it's another example. I need access to be able to update inventory that I pick. When I pick a box off of one of those big shelves, I need to be able to update the inventory and subtract that box from the inventory. Those are the types of things that we talk about in these discussions with our business customers. And we understand why they need it, we document it, and what system and what access it relates to. So I start with, what is your function that you do? What population does that function, if we've identified it already? And if we haven't, we create a new population. And what application do you use to perform that function? And lastly, what access or what group, AD group, whatever, grants that access within an application? So it's all mapped together. Okay. I'm getting low on time, so I'm just going to go to the next one, which is the next thing you do is you want to design a role architecture. So this is where you take the populations and their access and you figure out what combinations of roles would be best for that population. You could have 3 different types of warehouses, but you could have 5 roles. You could have 6 roles. It just depends on how you segment the functions and the populations within those warehouses to make it seem like more flexible. You want to build flexibility into your role architecture. And then you implement your roles, starting with just creating the roles so that they have people in them, but they don't have access. Once they have members, once the roles have members, you run a report and you give it to the person you're working with, your business customer, and say, does this population of users look accurate to you? And if they say yes, that's great. You move ahead and put the access on the role. If they say no, well, I would tweak a little here and there, you update your configurations of the roles so that the role more accurately reflects the population you're trying to target. And then finally, you grant the access to the role and you update your documentation and you let the customer know that you're done. I put this slide in the PDF so you can reference it later. And that's it. Lynn?
Great, thank you. Wonderful. So let's go ahead here and end the slides. Thank you, Rachel. Oh, I was so close to the camera there.
Ah,
So wonderful presentation. Thank you for all that great
you.
knowledge sharing. And we do have a question that came in from the audience.
Okay.
Well, it was about your cat. We need to give the
Oh my
cat
God, that's fine.
answer.
She runs away from me. She won't let me pick her up because I got her when she was already probably around 8 or 9 years, well, pretty recently. She's 16. I got her when she was already more than 10. And I think she was traumatized at some point, so she doesn't like to be picked up.
Yeah.
And if you pet her, she always wants to have an escape route. But she's so funny. Like,
Yeah, well, she
yeah.
certainly does sound like a crying child, like a crying baby in the background. So
Could
good
you hear it?
you did define that.
Oh my God. I have to tell people it's not a baby because then they get really worried otherwise.
Yeah, really good. So we do have a question is, what has been the biggest challenge while building RBAC?
A lot of times it's people, the business doesn't always have time, or they think it's an exercise that's not going to help them. Like, I think a lot of people in business think of technology and especially security as a blocker to things. And in identity and access management, we really are a business service in a lot of ways. We make things easier, like you have to do user access reviews. My teammate David is working on streamlining user access reviews, so it's not so difficult. Like, that's really what we want to do, because we want to make security easier for people so they'll do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that a lot of people understand that that's what we do, and so they just kind of want to put it off and not be engaged. But there are people, like the early adopters. We try to find the early adopters who recognize it and want to get in before everyone else does.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
And then is this something similar to role mining?
Um, Role mining is one of the tools we use. Like I said before, if you run a report of all the access that someone has, that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that that access should be everything they get in their role. It's a starting point. And role mining also, like when I hear role mining, I think this is Rachel's role. This is everything she gets, which means Rachel has one role. That's
Right.
You don't want to design a system like that because it's not flexible and it doesn't allow the business to grow and to expand. It just kind of backs you into a corner.
Okay, great. Thank you for
Mhm.
that clarification. Some more questions have come in. And how hard was your journey into cyber with a non-technical bachelor's degree? I mean, that was really shocking to me as well.
Yeah.
Yes, I was like, this is fantastic. It's these experiences of getting into cyber that are so valuable for you to share for others to be able to hear about this. So that's a
Yeah.
great question. So I'd love
I,
for you to expand on that more.
oh my gosh. So I told you it was my ex-husband who was like a SiteMinder architect. I'm not going to name the companies that he worked for, but there's pretty major companies. And this was back in 2000, 2001. So this was at a time when single sign-on was a nice to have, and the only companies that really cared about it were like finance companies, because
Mhm.
all the other companies were like, we don't need this. What is this? This is just a nice to have. And he told me, he's like, Rachel, you could do this. And I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, you could do this. And then so he told me to start studying up on what is the definition of provisioning. What is, like, so I can at least sound like I know what I was doing.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, like, I got my first consulting job doing this in 2005. And that's a long, long time ago. And I've learned so much, and the technology has changed so much that I don't know if people who are younger than me can have the same route as me, but I like to believe they can. And actually, I think they probably can, actually. I don't know. There are non-technical routes into technology in general. Like,
Mhm.
technology orgs do hire people with liberal arts degrees. They just may not hire them as coders off the bat. But if
Mhm.
you get into a technology org, or even a company that has a technology department as an analyst, that's a good route. or as a project manager, you can learn enough to get into and get that experience to get into those types of roles.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So we have another question. How to better optimize an RBAC framework for a startup that does a lot of testing, meaning they need a lot of test users?
You mean the role-based access controls would be for testing only, or?
That's what it seems like. The question is how to better optimize an RBAC framework for a startup that does a lot of testing, meaning they need to add a lot of test users. Yeah.
Oh. Oh, I think I understand what's being said. Like they'll be testing, for example, maybe software, and so they'll need to test different use cases for that software.
Mm-hmm.
I would look at the use case or the test case in this example of like what you're testing the software for, assuming that that's it, and what functions or what screens should those test users should be able to access to run the tests.
Okay.
And I would I don't know, it really depends, because if an application uses its own roles, internal application roles, to grant access to screens or to functions, then you would need to look at that application and how it performs. That's the best answer I can give, like knowing what I know right now.
Great. Well, that's very good.
Yeah.
And would a role for everyone or all ever be appropriate for things like emergency response programs?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I can tell you at Wayfair, we actually, our team normally get told, oh, just give it to everyone or give it to all engineers. And most of the time, that's not what they want. But we have a swag store where you can buy Wayfair merchandise, like t-shirts or whatever. That literally is for everyone. Everyone who works at Wayfair can buy Wayfair branded swag. And so it's really just about understanding when they say they want it for everyone, is it really everyone? And just kind of delving into that a little more. So yeah, sometimes it is appropriate.
All right, great. Thank you. And what is your take on RBAC with respect to cloud and on-prem environments? And that will be the last question of today's webinar.
So I worked in places, so we use SailPoint. We use SailPoint Identity now, which is a cloud IAM solution.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Wayfair was one of the first adopters or one of the earlier customers of Identity Now before it had a lot of capabilities built out. So we have a really great engineering team that's done a lot of, there's my cat again, done a lot, so funny.
I know.
Done a lot of like extending and customization of Identity Now, like scripts and everything like that. And it's great because it has the high availability. We don't have to like shut down servers, restart servers in certain orders. Like with, I worked at places that use IIQ and it was on-prem. And I think it was installed across like 11 servers at this one place. And then every time that it just went down, it had to like shut it down, roll it up and everything. And so there's none of that, but IIQ is the on-prem version is very customizable. The problem with that is that people back themselves into a corner because they customize it so much that they don't get support. With Identity Now, I think or cloud solutions in general, this could be changing because they've become more mature, but I think there's a lot more flexibility and there's more support.
Great. Wonderful. Well, this information has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I know, Rachel, that you provided our webinar manager with additional slides. She'll be uploading those and everyone will be receiving a copy of that. So that will be available for anyone. Thank you, everyone that has joined the webinar today. We're so happy that you're able to share a part of your afternoon with us and to be able to learn and grow more with the WiCyS organization. Of course, we are grateful for Wayfair being a strategic partner and for putting on today's webinar. If there's any additional questions from the audience, please email info@wicys.org and we'll certainly handle those questions ourselves, or we'll navigate them on over to Rachel and she can answer those questions directly. And with that, it's a wrap. So we really appreciate your time and attention to this topic today. And if there's anything else, Rachel, would you like to leave the audience with anything else?
I just want to say thank you to Rashna, who helped me with this. And one of the things that Rashna suggested that I do, she's at Wayfair, is to talk about how if you are a creative type, you're not an engineer, you might think out of the box. You might have like your own way of creating and thinking. This is a good area for you to get into. So that's where I'm going to leave it. And thank you, Lynn and WiCyS, for having me.
Great. Well, thank you. I love it. Have a great afternoon, and thank you, everyone. We'll catch up again sometime soon.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.